Houdini provides us with a quick, interactive way of selecting by pattern in the viewport. It's fairly limited in terms of the kinds of patterns we can select, but it is useful for selecting multiple loops of components. The way that it works is that we select a base pattern, so I'll select this primitive here, and I'll hold down Shift and select this second primitive here. And now I can tap Shift P to set this as the pattern. If Houdini accepts this as a valid pattern, we get this notification in the top left of the viewport. Once this pattern's set, we can hold down the Shift key and then use the arrow keys to expand the pattern in a specific direction. So while I'm holding down the Shift key, I'll tap the up arrow key, and that expands the pattern forwards one increment at a time. Tapping the down arrow key expands the pattern backwards by a single increment at a time. Shift plus the right arrow key expands the pattern to the right, and Shift plus the left arrow key expands it to the left. It's these kinds of patterns of evenly spaced partial or full loops that this pattern selection method is useful for. You might expect to be able to specify a grid-like pattern of alternating primitives. For example, if I clear this selection by left-clicking in an empty space, and now select alternating primitives in both the vertical and horizontal directions. Now I'll hit Shift P to try and set this as the pattern, and we see that Houdini doesn't accept it as a valid pattern. Houdini only allows the pattern to be specified in a single dimension. So, for example, we can specify a horizontal pattern or a vertical pattern, but not a two-dimensional pattern in both directions. Now, whilst this might seem quite limiting, it is still a useful tool for direct modelling. And we also have a powerful procedural node for selecting by pattern, which we'll look at in detail later on. To quickly select full loops, we can extend the pattern to the end of the geometry in a given direction by adding the Control key. So if I say select this primitive at the bottom, and I'll miss two primitives, and then holding down the Shift key I'll select the next one. Now I'll hold Shift and tap the P key to set this as the pattern. And now if we want to extend this pattern all the way up to the top of the grid, I can hold down Control, Shift and tap the up arrow key, and that extends the pattern all the way to the top of the grid. While I'm still holding down Control and Shift, I can tap the right arrow key to extend it all the way to the right hand side of the grid. And if I tap the left arrow key, I can extend it all the way to the left hand side of the grid. So this is a useful technique for quickly selecting full loops at specific increments apart. Now, the arrow keys don't necessarily correspond to the way that we're looking at the geometry in the viewport. They correspond to the direction that we set the pattern. We can think of it as though we're specifying a vector. So if I were to set a pattern in this direction by selecting a first primitive and then a second primitive, it's as though the first primitive we select is the origin and the second primitive is the head of the vector. So this becomes the forward direction for the pattern. I'll hit Shift P to set this as the pattern, and now holding down Shift and tapping the up arrow key will expand the pattern forwards in that direction, and the down arrow key expands it backwards in the opposite direction to the way that I set the pattern. Then naturally, with this direction being forwards, this direction is going to be right, and this direction is going to be left. So Shift plus the right arrow key expands the pattern to the right in this direction, and Shift plus the left arrow key expands the pattern to the left in this direction. So the arrow keys correspond with the direction that we set the pattern. Another option that we have for expanding the pattern is to expand it to the cursor position, and we can do that by holding down Shift and the K key. For example, if I set a new pattern in this direction, now I can hold down Shift and the K key to expand the selection forwards to my cursor position. This doesn't really work for continuing to expand the selection left or right. As we can see, it only expands a single row left or right, and not the whole selection. So in this lesson, we've seen how we can use select by pattern, and in the next lesson, we'll look at putting it to use in a practical example,